Why would an 88-year-old woman let her own family call her a hoarder, rather than throw away one faded quilt? That was the question hanging over the old farmhouse the morning Mabel Rowe stood by her bedroom door with both hands wrapped around her cane, while her daughter-in-law held open a black trash bag as if mercy could be folded up and carried to the curb. They said the room needed to be cleared. They said the farmhouse had to be shown. They said old fabric was only clutter. But the German shepherd at Mabel's side did not look at the trash bag. He looked at one quilt, and he would not take his eyes off it. Mabel Rowe was 88 years old, with a soft back bend that made her seem smaller until she lifted her chin and looked someone in the eye. For more than 40 years, she had been the woman neighbors came to when a baby needed a blanket, a church raffle needed a quilt, or a grieving widow needed scraps of a husband's shirts turned into something she could still hold. Her hands were slower now. Arthritis had curled 2 fingers on her left hand and left her knuckles swollen like old buttons beneath the skin. But her stitches had once kept half the county warm. And even now she folded fabric straighter than most people folded their own shirts. The farmhouse itself had been standing longer than anyone still living in it. White paint peeled from the porch rails. The kitchen floor answered every step with a tired creak. A narrow hall carried the smell of coffee, cheddar, and winter apples no matter the season. Out behind the house stood the old barn, leaning just enough to worry people who did not love it, but not enough to fall. Mabel loved that barn the way some people loved a graveyard, because both places held more than the living knew how to count. She had not always lived there alone. For 37 years, she had shared it with Walter Rowe, a quiet farmer with tobacco-brown hands and a habit of tapping the table before he spoke. He had been gone for 11 years now. Their son Curtis had started coming by more often after Walter died. First to fix gutters, then to check bills, then to suggest ideas Mabel had not asked for. Curtis never sounded cruel. That was what made the pressure harder to name. He sounded practical. He said roofs did not care about memories. He said taxes did not pause for sentiment. He said a smaller place would be easier on her. By the time his wife Denise began using the word hoarder, practicality had become a door, closing one small click at a time. Mabel still kept a life of her own inside those closing clicks. Every morning she woke before sunrise, pulled on her cardigan in the dark, and shuffled to the kitchen with one hand along the wall. She measured dry food into a metal bowl for Boone before she poured hot water over her oatmeal. She took her blood pressure pill with half a glass of water, then wrapped the other half in a paper towel around a small jar of cut flowers, if the garden still offered any. She brushed Boone with short, patient strokes on the back steps when the weather was kind, and on the mudroom rug when it was not. He was a large German shepherd with dark saddle fur, one torn ear from his shelter days, and a way of leaning against her leg as if he understood balance better than gravity did. Boone had come into her life 4 years earlier. After a shelter volunteer asked whether she would take an older dog no one else wanted. He had arrived wary, thin, and too alert to every sound. Mabel had never tried to turn him into something cheerful. She fed him on time, spoke softly, and let him decide where safety lived. Since then, he had taken it upon himself to learn the house, the porch, the path to the mailbox, and the rhythm of Mabel's breathing. He knew when her knees were bad. He knew when a stranger pulled into the drive before the tires finished crunching gravel. Most of all, he knew that some objects in that house mattered long after other people had stopped seeing them. Curtis arrived that Saturday with a roll of contractor bags in the truck, and the same smile he used at bank counters and church dinners. Denise came in behind him carrying cardboard boxes marked donate, keep, and trash. She moved quickly, the way people do when they have already decided that slowness is resistance. "We're only helping," she said as she opened Mabel's sewing room closet. "If the realtor comes next week, this place has to breathe." Curtis added that no one was trying to upset her. He said the upstairs room full of quilts made buyers nervous. He said the farmhouse would never sell if it looked stuffed with old things. Denise gave the word its sharp little edge when she said it. "You can't keep living like a hoarder, Mabel." They said it in front of her, then around her, then over here, as if the chair by the window were empty. Mabel did not answer at first. Her thumb moved over the worn curve of her cane handle while Boone pressed his shoulder against her calf. The sewing room had once been Walter's little office before life turned it into hers. Shelves lined one wall with folded fabric sorted by color. A cedar chest sat beneath the far window. 3 quilts hung over the back of a wooden rocker, each one washed thin with years and touch. To Denise, it was clutter. To Mabel, it was the only room left in the house that still remembered her hands at work. "Those can go," Denise said, lifting 2 faded patchwork quilts as if they weighed nothing. "No one uses them." "I do," Mabel said quietly. Curtis gave a patient sigh. "Mom, nobody means every single one. We're talking about the old damaged ones. The ones piled in the chest. The torn ones. The ones that smell musty." Mabel looked past him to the cedar chest. The smell he called musty was cedar, winter wool, and the faintest trace of the lavender soap she had once tucked between folded blankets. "Not the blue one," she said. Denise did not ask which blue one. There were several. "This is exactly what I mean," she said. "You're attached to scraps. This is why we need to sort for you." "For you?" Mabel had once heard a nurse use the same tone with a man who still knew his own birthday. Her shoulders tightened. The room had gone strangely small. She was not afraid of quilts leaving the house because they were fabric. She was afraid because one of them was not only fabric. And she no longer trusted herself to explain that in a way anyone would honor. Years ago, Walter had placed one folded quilt into the cedar chest with uncommon care. He had tapped the lid once and told her, "If they ever stop hearing you, keep the old blue one." He had not explained more. At the time, she had laughed and asked what trouble he expected. He had only said, "Trouble that arrives looking helpful." That memory had sat inside her for years like a seed in dry ground. She had never spoken it aloud to Curtis. After Walter died, there had always seemed to be a better day, a calmer mood, a more useful moment. Then the months had started filling with estimates, suggestions, papers, and the quiet insult of decisions made near her but not with her. The house payment was long finished. The land behind the barn was the part people kept circling in conversation. A road project had been rumored not far from there. A new buyer had asked questions about acreage. Curtis said selling now would spare everyone future trouble. Denise said no one was stealing anything. Yet both of them behaved like time itself might expose them if they waited too long. Boone had been still until Denise crossed the room toward the cedar chest. Then his head lifted. His ears tipped forward. He did not bark. He never barked without reason. He moved first to Mabel's side, then to the chest, placing himself between Denise and the brass latch. Denise stopped and laughed once. Too lightly. "Honestly, that dog acts like he owns the room." "No," Mabel said. "He knows the room." Curtis stepped forward and clicked his tongue. "Boone." "Out." The dog did not move. Mabel saw it then. The small tightening around Curtis's mouth. The one he wore when something simple refused to stay simple. Boone lowered his nose to the chest lid, then turned and nudged Mabel's hand. Not random. Not restless. A reminder. Her pulse kicked once in her throat. "Open it," she whispered. Not to Curtis, but to herself. Denise reached past Boone, flipped the latch, and pulled back the lid. Inside lay neatly folded quilts stacked by size and season. Some were bright with old feed sack patterns. Some were winter-heavy and stitched with dark thread. And there, near the bottom, was the one Mabel had meant. Blue, tobacco brown, and cream, pieced from Walter's work shirts, one church dress hem, and a curtain panel from the room they had painted this summer. Curtis turned 12. Denise lifted it by 2 corners. "This one's frayed clear through," she said. "Mabel, this is exactly the sort of thing you need help letting go of." "No." The word came out sharper than Mabel expected. "Not that one." Denise folded the quilt once, twice, and shoved it into the open trash bag anyway. Boone moved so fast the bag crackled sideways. He caught the bottom edge in his teeth and pulled. Denise yelped. Curtis grabbed for the handles. Mabel stepped forward on aching knees. One hand out. Not fast enough to stop anyone. Only fast enough to feel the panic rise. The bag tipped, hit the floor, and slid across the boards. Boone dragged it through the doorway, down the hall, and all the way to the front porch, where sunlight cut across the torn plastic. When the bag snagged on a nailhead near the threshold, the blue quilt slipped partly free, and along one inside fold, Mabel saw a row of hand stitches that did not match the rest. If the quilt was only junk, why did Boone drag it into the sunlight as if the porch itself needed to see it? Mabel stood in the doorway with one hand braced against the frame and the other pressed flat to her chest. Not because she was fainting, but because her heart had started moving too fast for her old body. The black trash bag lay torn across the porch boards. The blue quilt spilled out of it in a crooked fold. Half shadow, half morning light. Boone planted his front paws on either side of the fabric and lowered his head over it. Not growling, not showing teeth, only holding his place with the quiet certainty of a dog who had decided that no one would carry that quilt away again. Denise came after him first. Her cheeks flushed from embarrassment more than effort. "This is ridiculous," she said, reaching for the bag. "Curtis, get him off it." Curtis stepped onto the porch, but he did not bend down. He looked at Boone, then at Mabel, then at the torn quilt. "Mom, we can't have the dog destroying things every time we try to help." Mabel wanted to say that Boone had not destroyed anything that had not already been put in a trash bag. She wanted to say that help did not usually require a label, a deadline, and a realtor waiting in the wings. Instead, she took one careful step onto the porch. Her left knee trembled. Boone glanced back at her, and the movement was small enough that no one else seemed to notice. But Mabel did. He was asking whether she was still with him. "I need to see the seam," she said. Denise let out a breath. The seam Mabel pointed with two swollen fingers. "There, along the inside fold." Curtis looked down, then back toward the driveway, where his truck sat with the tailgate still open. "It's a quilt, Mom. Quilts have seams." "Not that kind," Mabel said. Her voice did not rise. That was one of the last strong things age had left her. She could make quiet sound heavier than shouting. She lowered herself slowly to the porch step, ignoring the way Denise reached out as if Mabel might crumble simply because she bent her knees. Boone shifted just enough to give her room. The boards were cool under her shoes. Sunlight made dust shine in the air. Mabel touched the blue fabric and felt time gather beneath her fingertips. The quilt had not been one of her showpieces. It had no fancy star pattern, no prize ribbon stitching, no bright border meant to catch a judge's eye at the church hall. It was a working quilt, made from things that had already lived. Walter's brown work shirt was in the middle square, soft from years of barn chores and fence mending. A strip of cream cotton came from the curtain she had taken down after the first hailstorm cracked the west window. The blue pieces had come from a dress she wore the year Curtis got his first bicycle, and Walter sold 2 calves to buy it. Nothing in that quilt had been expensive. That was why people like Denise could not imagine it holding value. Mabel slid her thumb along the fold. The stitches there were not hers. She knew her own hand the way other people knew their signature. Her stitches leaned slightly right when she was tired and tightened near corners because she never trusted corners. These were smaller, rougher, made with dark thread that did not match the cotton. A man sewing, maybe, or someone working without a lamp. Her throat tightened as soon as she thought it. Walter had hidden something inside the quilt after she finished it. Boone sniffed the seam and gave one low breath through his nose. Not a bark, not a warning, a confirmation. Denise folded her arms. "Are we really doing this on the porch?" "For once," Mabel said. "We are doing it where everyone can see." The words surprised even her. Curtis looked away, and that small turn of his face hurt more than if he had argued. When he was a boy, he had brought every torn shirt to this same porch. He would stand barefoot with grass stains on his knees, saying, "Mama, can you fix it?" She had fixed cuffs, pockets, ripped jackets, school play costumes, and once a stuffed rabbit that had been loved nearly flat. She had fixed so many things that perhaps the family had confused repair with endlessness. They thought because she had always mended, she would never notice being cut. Mabel asked for her sewing basket. Denise looked as if she might refuse, then went back inside and returned with the oval basket from the chair. The lid was dusty because Mabel had been using a smaller tin lately. The big basket was too heavy to lift from the floor on bad mornings. Inside were needles, a tomato-shaped pincushion, small scissors, and a folded packet of thread cards wrapped in wax paper. Mabel chose the narrow scissors with black handles. Boone's eyes followed the metal, but he did not flinch. He had watched her trim loose threads for years. Curtis shifted his weight. Maybe we should wait. If there's something inside, we shouldn't ruin it. That did not worry you when it was in the trash, Mabel said. No one answered. A crow called once from the maple near the drive, somewhere inside the house. The kitchen clock ticked as if it had no opinion. Mabel bent close, squinting through the lower part of her glasses. The seam had been made not along the outer edge but inside a fold that would only show if the quilt was opened the wrong way. She clipped one thread, then another. Her fingers shook, so she paused and placed the scissors on her knee. Boone moved his muzzle under her wrist and lifted it gently, the way he did when she forgot to take her evening pills. Mabel smiled despite the ache in her chest. I know, she whispered. Slow. That was how she lived now. Slow. She washed one dish at a time because a full sink pulled too hard on her back. She carried Boone's food in a small scoop instead of lifting the whole bag. She wrote checks at the kitchen table under the lamp and put each receipt in an old cookie tin. She kept canned soup on the lower shelf, not because she liked it best, but because reaching high had become a negotiation. None of that meant she no longer knew what mattered. None of that made her a hoarder. It meant she had learned to build a life inside limits other people mistook for failure. She clipped the last thread. The fold loosened. Denise leaned forward despite herself. Curtis put one hand on the porch rail. Boone sat so close his shoulder touched Mabel's knee. Slowly, Mabel opened the blue square back from the lining. A narrow paper packet rested inside, wrapped in wax paper browned at the crease. It had been flattened so carefully that it almost became part of the quilt. Around it, the cotton held a faint smell of cedar and something else. Something dry and earthy, like the old barn after rain. Mabel did not pick it up at once. She looked at Curtis first. Your father put this here. You don't know that, Curtis said, but his voice had lost its bank counter steadiness. Mabel touched the packet with one finger. On the outside, in Walter's blocky handwriting, were 4 words. For Mabel. If needed. The porch seemed to pull all sound into itself. Denise stopped moving. Curtis blinked once. Hard. Mabel heard her own breath. Boone's quiet, panting, and a truck passing far down the road. The handwriting was not a memory. It was not a feeling. It was not clutter. It was Walter's hand, pressed into paper, waiting longer than any of them had been willing to listen. She lifted the packet, and the wax paper crackled like dry leaves. Inside was a letter folded around a smaller rectangle. Mabel saw only the top line before Curtis said, Too quickly. Maybe I should take that inside. Boone stood before Mabel had a chance to answer. He did not lung. He did not bark. He simply placed his body between Curtis's hand and the letter, his torn ear angled forward, his paws square on the old porch boards. For the first time that morning, Curtis did not tell the dog to move. He looked at the handwriting, and his hand fell back to his side. Mabel unfolded the letter slowly. The first sentence was not about money. That was what made her fingers stop shaking. Walter had not begun with land, sale value, or instructions. He had begun with an apology. Mabel, if you are reading this, then someone has forgotten what the back acres cost you. The words blurred behind her glasses. She took them off, wiped them on the edge of her cardigan, and put them back on. Denise's face had changed. The certainty had drained out of it, leaving irritation trying to disguise itself as concern. Curtis said nothing. Boone remained standing, still watching his hand. Mabel read the sentence again, this time aloud. Her voice cracked on the word you, not because she was weak, but because Walter had used the word no one in that house had been using correctly. Not the house, not the sale, not the problem. You, beneath the letter. The smaller rectangle slipped onto the quilt. It was an old hand-drawn map, the kind Walter used to sketch on feed store paper. With the barn, the fence line, the spring, and the narrow strip of land beyond the back pasture marked in pencil. Along the lower edge, Walter had written another note. She kept the promise when I could not. Curtis reached for the porch rail as if the old wood might steady him. Denise stared at the map, then at the torn trash bag. Mabel kept one hand on Boone's collar and one hand on the letter. The quilt did not prove everything. Not yet. But it had proved one thing no one on that porch could put back into the bag. The old blue quilt had not been hiding trash. It had been holding Walter's unfinished sentence. What did Walter mean when he wrote that? Mabel kept the promise when he could not. The map lay on the quilt between them. Pencil lines faint but stubborn. The barn drawn as a crooked square. The spring marked with a small circle. And the back acres shaded in a way Mabel had not seen for years. Curtis stared at it as if the paper had spoken in a voice he did not want to recognize. Denise reached for ordinary words first. It's an old sketch, she said. People make notes. That doesn't mean anything about the sale. Mabel did not answer her. She was looking at the place where Walter had drawn the fence line wrong on purpose. Walter had known land like scripture. That little bend near the spring was not a survey line. It was a memory marker. Boone lowered his nose to the map, sniffed the lower edge, then turned toward the yard, toward the barn, toward the strip of land behind it that no one had wanted to discuss in front of Mabel until a buyer started asking questions. He wants to go out back, Mabel said. Curtis shook his head. Mom. No. The grass is wet. You'll fall. I did not say I was running, Mabel said. Denise looked toward the driveway. We have a lot to do today. This can wait. Mabel put the letter into her cardigan pocket. It has waited 11 years. Mabel stood slowly, holding the porch post until the house stopped tilting. Boone stepped close, broad shoulder against her thigh. He did not pull. He offered his body like a railing. Without pity. Curtis tried again. Softer. Let me look first. Mabel turned to him. You were going to throw it away first. His face tightened. That isn't fair. No, she said. It was not. Curtis had arrived with bills in his head, a buyer in his ear, and the belief that old age made his mother's attachment smaller than his urgency. That was how harm often entered a family. Not as a monster, but as a helpful schedule. They crossed the yard slowly. Mabel wore house shoes that should not have been in wet grass. Denise followed with the trash bag folded in one hand. Curtis carried the quilt only after Boone watched him. The map stayed in Mabel's pocket with a letter, close enough to remind her that she had not invented Walter's voice. The barn waited at the edge of the yard. Red paint mostly gone. One door hanging lower than the other. The smell reached them before they reached it. Old hay. Dust. Rusted tools. And rain caught in wood. Boone went straight to the side wall. Not the door. He sniffed along the baseboards, then moved toward the back corner where an old workbench stood beneath a cracked window. In the dust under the workbench were raccoon tracks, boot scuffs, and one narrow scrape line leading toward the wall. Mabel saw the scrape line and stopped. What is it? Curtis asked. She pointed. That board has been moved. Denise gave a small laugh. Mabel, this barn is falling apart. Everything has moved. But Boone had already pushed his nose under the lower plank. He huffed once, then began pawing at the packed dirt. Careful but insistent. He worked at one place, looked back at Mabel, and worked again. The sound of claws against dirt filled the barn. It made Mabel think of the winter they nearly lost the house, when she sewed day and night for neighbors until a few dollars at a time kept the lights on. Curtis had been young. He remembered new shoes appearing. He did not remember the midnight lamp. Boone's paw hit metal. The sound was not loud. Boone stopped digging and stepped back. His nose still pointed at the spot. Curtis crouched before anyone asked him. With his fingers, he brushed away damp soil until a small tin box appeared. It was not a treasure chest. It was an old tobacco tin. Rust freckled. Lid dented. The painted label almost gone. A strip of waxed cloth had been wrapped around it, tied with baling twine. Curtis lifted it out and set it on the workbench. Denise looked relieved for 1 second. "See," she said. "Old junk in an old barn." Mabel did not look at her. She looked at the twine knot. Walter had tied that knot. Her swollen fingers could not manage it anymore. "Cut it," she said. Curtis took out his pocket knife. Boone watched the blade, then watched Curtis's face. The dog had not forgotten the hand that reached for the letter too quickly. Curtis moved slowly, cut the twine, and peeled back the waxed cloth. Inside the tin were 3 things: a narrow key with a paper tag browned by age, a folded receipt from a feed store, and a photograph cut in half so neatly that only Mabel's shoulder and Walter's hand remained in the frame. The other half was gone. Denise stopped calling it junk. Curtis picked up the receipt. "This is from years ago." Mabel leaned close. The date was written at the top in blue ink. She knew that year. It was the year Walter's brother Earl wanted to sell the back strip to cover his own debts. It was the year Mabel had taken every quilt order she could find. It was the year Curtis started college and never knew how close the farmhouse came to leaving them. The receipt was not for feed. On the bottom line, beneath grain and fence staples, someone had written payment received toward spring parcel agreement. Initials followed. One Walter's and one belonging to a man Mabel had not thought about in years. "Who is Harlan Pike?" Curtis asked. Mabel closed her eyes. Harlan had owned the feed store then. He had also kept informal copies of half the town's small agreements because people trusted his counter more than they trusted offices. If Walter had hidden a key with Harlan's initials on a receipt, the key did not open a box in the barn. It opened something at the old feed store, she said. Denise frowned. The feed store closed. The building closed. Mabel said, "Harlan's daughter still runs the records room for the co-op." Curtis looked from the key to the receipt to the cut photograph. "Why would Dad hide this from us?" Mabel touched the half photograph. Walter's hand rested on her shoulder in it. That was the part left behind. Not Earl. Not Harlan. Not any buyer. Here. Tears would have let Denise believe the paper was only sentimental. It was not. It was a path. Boone sat beside the workbench, dust on his muzzle, his body finally easing. The quilt had led to the letter. The letter had led to the map. The map had led to the barn. And the barn had given them a key, with a name Curtis could not explain away. Mabel closed her fingers around the key. The metal was cold, small, and heavier than it had any right to be. The receipt did not settle the land. It opened a locked place where the family's story might finally have to meet someone else's records. Why would a small key from a buried tobacco tin matter more than a signed offer sitting in Curtis's truck? Mabel held the key in her palm while the barn dust settled around them. And for a moment she understood why Walter had hidden the path in pieces. One paper could be laughed away. One memory could be called confusion. One quilt could be called trash. But a quilt, a letter, a map, a buried tin, a receipt, and a key, all pointing in the same direction, did something different. They made the family slow down. Curtis did not want to slow down. His phone buzzed before they reached the porch. He looked at the screen, turned it over, and put it in his pocket, as if Mabel had not seen the realtor's name. Denise walked behind them with the blue quilt folded over her arms because Boone would not let anyone else carry it. The quilt she had called junk had become too important to drop, and Boone knew it before the people did. Inside the kitchen, Mabel laid the key, receipt, letter, map, and half photograph on the table one by one. She placed them in a line, like pieces of testimony waiting their turn. Boone drank from his bowl near the stove, then settled against Mabel's shoes. The morning had begun as a simple invasion and had become something no one could fold back into a box. Curtis pulled out a chair but did not sit. Mom, even if Dad wrote that, it doesn't mean the land can't be sold. Mabel looked at the receipt. I did not say that. Then what are we proving that I did not keep that quilt because I could not let go of scraps? Denise sighed. Mabel, no one meant to hurt you. Mabel looked up then. People say that after they have already chosen the words. The room went quiet. Boone lifted his head, reading the quiet as carefully as any command. Curtis rubbed both hands over his face. I'm trying to keep this from becoming a mess. It was a mess when you decided I was the mess. Mabel said. She had not planned to say it. It came out with the steadiness of a stitch pulled through heavy cloth. Curtis looked at her as if he had suddenly remembered she had a mind separate from his worry. Not an apology, but a pause wide enough for truth to step into. Denise found the next defense. Fine. We can call Harlan's daughter. But if this turns out to be nothing, we still have to finish clearing the house. The buyer can wait until I understand what is being sold. Mabel said. Curtis's jaw moved. You know what's being sold. No, she said. I know what you keep naming. I do not know what Walter was trying to protect. That sentence landed harder than she expected. For years, Walter had been reduced to a picture in the hall and a few stories told at holidays. But Mabel remembered the man fully. Walter did not hide money. He hid shame. He hid promises. He hid things when the truth might hurt someone before it saved them. Mabel asked Curtis to bring her the wall phone from the hall table. The old handset had large buttons and a cord to reach her chair. Denise almost smiled at it. People who mocked old tools usually did so right before needing them. She still knew Harlan Pike's old number by memory. The number now rang through to the co-op office. A young man answered first. Mabel gave her name, then asked for Ruth Pike Mercer. There was a pause, then a transfer, then a woman's voice, cautious and kind. This is Ruth. Ruth. This is Mabel Rowe. Walter's Mabel. On the other end, the woman inhaled softly. Mrs. Rove. I haven't heard that name in a long time. I found something with your father's initials on it. Mabel said. A receipt. A key. It may concern the spring parcel behind our barn. The silence after that was not empty. It was full of recognition. Ruth did not ask whether Mabel was confused. She did not say old papers often meant nothing. She asked, Is the paper tag on the key still there? Mabel looked at the tag. Yes. Does it say drawer 3 or drawer 5? Mabel read the faded pencil. Drawer 3. Ruth breathed out. Then you should come here before anyone signs anything. Curtis sat down at last. Denise straightened. What does that mean? Mabel kept the phone to her ear. What is in drawer 3? I can't say over the phone what I haven't put my hands on. Ruth said. But my father kept duplicate envelopes for private land understandings when families were afraid papers would disappear. It was not official advice. It was his habit. If Walter left you that key, he wanted you to see whatever he put there. Mabel closed her eyes. Not because she was tired, although she was. Because one person outside the house had treated Walter's trail as real, Ruth added. And Mrs. Rowe, yes. My father used to say you were the reason that farm made it through the bad winter. I remember women coming into the store to pay you for quilts. They paid in cash. Quine. Eggs. Whatever they had. You brought it all to the counter in a blue tin. The blue tin. Mabel's hand went to the edge of the table. She had forgotten the color until Ruth said it. Memory returned through objects the way light returned through a cracked shade. Curtis looked at her. And this time his face was not impatient. It was uncertain. Mabel thanked Ruth and promised they would come that afternoon. When she hung up, Denise said, We should not all go. This is turning into some kind of spectacle. Boone stood. It was not dramatic. He rose from beneath the table and moved to the hallway where his leash hung on a hook. He sat beneath it and looked at Mabel. In 4 years, he had never asked for a ride unless Mabel had forgotten an appointment or a storm was coming. Curtis noticed. Denise did too. Mabel pushed back her chair. Boone and I are going, Curtis said. I'll drive. Mabel looked at him for a long second. You can drive if you understand I am not cargo. His eyes lowered. All right. Denise gathered the papers with quick fingers, then stopped when Boone gave one low sound from the hallway. Not a threat. A boundary. Mabel collected the letter, the map, the receipt, and the key herself, sliding them into a large brown envelope from the drawer where she kept stamps and vet records. Her hands were slow, but no one reached over them before they left. Mabel went back to the porch and lifted the blue quilt. Denise had folded it badly, corners uneven. Walter's shirt square tucked inside out. Mabel refolded it against the rail. Boone waited beside the steps, tail low, eyes fixed on the driveway. The quilt had given them the question. The barn had given them the key. Now the old feed store would decide whether Walter's hidden trail ended in memory, or in records no buyer could ignore. What could Ruth Pike's drawer prove that Mabel's own voice had not been allowed to prove? The old feed store stood at the edge of town with its faded green sign. Curtis parked near the side entrance, hands on the wheel. Denise sat in the back with her purse in her lap like a shield. Mabel held the envelope against her cardigan, the blue quilt folded across her knees. Boone waited between her feet, too large for the space and too disciplined to complain. His nose worked at the air from the cracked window. Old grain, motor oil, paper dust, rain in the gutters. He lifted his head when the side door opened, and Ruth Pike Mercer stepped out. Ruth was in her 70s, with silver hair cut short and a sweater buttoned wrong at the bottom. She looked at Mabel first. Not at Curtis. Not at Denise. Not at the envelope. People had been looking around Mabel all morning. Ruth came down the ramp slowly and said, Mrs. Rowe, I would have known you anywhere. Mabel gave a small laugh that almost hurt. Then you remember more than my own house did today. Ruth touched the quilt. My mother had one with this same blue. For a moment. The sale. The buyer. The trash bag. And the word hoarder loosened their grip. Mabel was not a problem in a passenger seat. She was a woman whose work had outlived her youth. Inside, the feed store still smelled like cracked corn and oiled wood. The back wall kept old drawers with brass label plates. Ruth led them to a small records room. Denise stayed near the doorway. I still don't understand why private papers would be here. Ruth looked over her glasses. Because some families were better at losing papers that embarrassed them than papers that profited them. Drawer 3 sat in the lower cabinet. Ruth asked Mabel to use the key herself. Curtis crouched to make room but did not take it from her. Mabel's fingers struggled with the old lock. Boone stepped close, against her calf. She took one breath, then another, and turned the key. The drawer opened with a wooden scrape. Inside were envelopes bound with string, each labeled in Harlan Pike's tidy handwriting. Ruth ran one finger along the names until she stopped at Rowe Spring Parcel. Beneath that, in smaller letters, Walter and Mabel. Not Walter Rowe alone. Not Rowe family. Walter and Mabel. No one spoke. Ruth untied the string and laid the envelope on the table. These are old, she said. I am not giving legal advice. I can only tell you what my father kept and what the copies show. That is enough, Mabel said. The first paper was a handwritten statement signed by Walter and witnessed by Harlan. It said the back spring parcel had been held out of a proposed sale because Mabel had raised money to satisfy Earl Rowe's debt share, and because Walter intended that no transfer of that parcel be discussed without Mabel being heard. It was not a court order, but it had dates, names, and the receipt number from the tobacco tin. The second paper was a copy of an old letter from Earl Rowe to Walter. Earl admitted he had taken money against the back acreage and asked Walter to keep it quiet because he was ashamed. Mabel's name appeared near the middle. Mabel paid what I could not. The letter said, I do not want Curtis growing up hearing his uncle nearly cost him the farm. Curtis sat down on a metal stool as if his knees had lost their argument. Mabel looked at the words. Walter had not hidden the truth because Mabel had done nothing. He had hidden it because she had done something generous enough to protect a man who never thanked her publicly. She had taken quilt money, egg money, hem repair money, and church raffle money, then paid down a family's shame so the farm would not split. Denise whispered. But if this was so important, why didn't Walter put it with the other papers? Ruth answered gently. Maybe he did not trust the other papers to stay where he put them. Boone turned his head toward Denise before anyone else did. Mabel followed the dog's gaze. Denise looked down at her purse, then away. Ruth unfolded the final item from the envelope. It was a photocopy of a photograph. Mabel and Walter stood beside the spring fence. Younger, sunburned, and tired. Earl stood off to one side with his hat in his hands. On the back, Harlan had written, "Day Mabel Rowe settled the spring debt. Original returned to Walter." Mabel placed the half photograph beside the copy. Her half showed Walter's hand on her shoulder. The missing half had shown Earl. Shame. And the reason Walter had cut the image apart. Not to erase Mabel. To keep Earl's failure from becoming Curtis's inheritance. Curtis covered his mouth with one hand. "You paid for that land, I paid what was needed," Mabel said. "Not all at once. Not in a way anyone would call important. With quilts," he said. "With work," she corrected. The correction was quiet. But it changed the room. Quilts were what people saw. Work was what they had taken for granted. Ruth slid a small ledger across the table. "My father kept payment notes. Not official records. Store notes. But the receipt numbers match. Some entries list fabric orders, mending payments, and deposits Walter made under both names." Curtis ran one finger down the page. Mabel recognized dates by seasons of her own body. The spring she sold 2 quilts to a church group. The month she turned an old coat into a blanket and used the payment for fence wire. Her life had been there, in small lines, while her family called the room clutter. Denise's voice sharpened. "This still does not mean the buyer is gone." Mabel looked at her then. "No. It means he is not buying my silence with my own work." Boone sat beside her chair and rested his chin on the folded quilt. Curtis closed the ledger slowly. "I didn't know." Mabel's answer came after a long breath. "You did not ask before you named me. That was the wound. Not only the sale, not only the quilt, the naming. Hoarder. Problem. Burden hidden inside the softer word help." Ruth made copies for Mabel and placed each one in a folder. "These should be reviewed by someone qualified," she said. "But whatever happens after that, your family cannot honestly say you kept those quilts because you were losing sense." Mabel nodded. As they walked back through the store, Boone stopped near an old display case by the front counter. He sniffed the lower shelf, then pawed once at the glass. Ruth paused. What did he find now? Behind the dusty glass, beneath seed catalogs and twine, lay a small blue tin with a strip of faded masking tape on the lid. Written on it, in Harlan Pike's hand, were 3 words Mabel had not heard in decades. Mabel's quilt money. Why would Harlan Pike keep a blue tin labeled Mabel's quilt money if her own family had been taught to remember her as only sentimental? Ruth unlocked the dusty display case while Mabel stood very still beside Boone, afraid that if she moved too quickly the past might scatter like thread clippings across a floor. The tin was no bigger than a lunch pail. Its blue paint had chipped along the rim, and one corner wore a dent shaped like a thumb. Mabel knew that dent. She had made it herself on the winter morning. She dropped the tin beside the feed store counter because her gloves were wet and her fingers had gone numb. Ruth set it on the counter with both hands. She did not open it immediately. She looked at Mabel first. My father kept things when he thought someone might need to remember them honestly. Denise made a small, impatient sound. We have already seen enough old papers. Boone's head turned toward her. Curtis did not speak. His face had changed again. Not into belief exactly, but into the uncomfortable place where belief begins breaking through pride. He looked at the tin the way a grown man looks at a photograph of a childhood room and realizes he never knew who paid to keep the roof over it. Ruth lifted the lid. Inside lay a stack of narrow paper slips tied with cotton string. 2 faded photographs. A small card from the county fair. And a folded square of blue fabric. No money remained. That almost made Mabel smile. Of course, there was no money. Money had been the thing she turned into other things. Fence wire, a tax payment, groceries when Walter's knee went bad, college shoes for Curtis. The tin had never been a savings box. It had been a passing place. Ruth untied the slips. These are receipt stubs from my father's counter. Some are in his hand. Some are in yours. Mabel touched the first one. Her younger handwriting leaned across the paper. Neat but hurried. Quilt order paid. Spring parcel. She had written. Another said. Hem repairs. Earl note. Another said. Church raffle quilt. Back fence. They were not formal enough to make Denise comfortable, and not vague enough to be dismissed as fantasy. Curtis read silently for a long time. Then he picked up the county fair card. On the front, in faded red print, it named a quilting prize from the year he had been 16. On the back, in Walter's handwriting, were the words, "She brought the ribbon home and put the money on the farm." Mabel remembered that ribbon. She had given it to a neighbor's little girl years later because the child liked the color. She had forgotten the prize money entirely. Walter had not. Denise crossed her arms. This is sweet, but it still doesn't change the fact that the house is too much for her. We are talking about safety, repairs, taxes, insurance, and a woman who keeps bags of old fabric upstairs. Mabel felt the old label trying to settle over her again. Heavier now because the truth had started to lift it. That was how people protected a false story. They did not always deny every fact. They simply moved the argument to another room. Ruth looked at Denise. Mrs. Rowe may need help. That is not the same thing as needing to be erased. The words were gentle. Denise flushed as if they had been shouted. Curtis set the fare card down. Denise. Stop. It was the first time all day he had interrupted his wife instead of his mother. Mabel did not celebrate it. She had lived too long to mistake one small correction for a repaired family. But Boone lifted his chin, and she felt the change through the leash. Denise stared at Curtis. You are letting a dog, some quilting scraps, and a woman from a feed store derail a sale that could solve a lot of problems. What problems? Mabel asked. Denise looked at her too quickly. Curtis closed his eyes. There it was. Not a document. Not yet. A shift in the air. The way Boone stiffened before thunder. Mabel had been told the sale was for her own good. The repairs. The taxes. The burden of the old place. But Denise had said solve a lot of problems. And she had not said whose. Boone gave one low sound from his chest. It was not aimed at Denise's body. It was aimed at the lie between her words. Ruth gathered the slips and placed them with the copied records. Mrs. Rowe, I can write a statement that these items were kept here by my father, and that the drawer key matched the receipt tag. It is not legal advice. It is only what I can attest. That would help, Mabel said. Curtis rubbed his forehead. We need to talk at home. Denise's laugh was thin. Now he wants to talk. Mabel picked up the folded blue fabric square from the tin. It was a leftover piece from the quilt. The same blue as the one Boone had rescued from the trash bag. On it, in tiny stitches that were not decorative, Mabel had embroidered a date. She stared at it until the numbers steadied in her mind. That date was the day she had made the last payment toward Earl's debt share. She had sewn the date into scrap because no one at home had wanted to mark it. Curtis saw it. Is that your stitching? Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Mabel turned the fabric over in her hand. You were a boy. Then you were busy. Then you were grieving your father. Then you were telling me what I could not understand. The answer did not accuse him loudly. That made it worse. They left the feed store with a folder of copies. Ruth's written statement. The blue tin. The key. The quilt. And more silence than they had brought in. Mabel's energy had begun to thin. Her knees ached from the slow walk. Her hands felt clumsy. Boone noticed before anyone else did. He leaned into her at the ramp, forcing her to pause. Curtis reached out, then stopped. Do you want my arm? Mabel considered saying no. Pride was sometimes the last chair left in a stripped room. But dignity was not the same as refusing every offered hand. She took his arm. You may help me walk, she said. You may not decide where I am going. Curtis nodded. Understood. Denise walked ahead to the car, phone already in her hand. Mabel saw her typing quickly. Curtis saw it too, at home. The driveway no longer felt like the same driveway. The contractor bags were still there. The donate boxes waited in the hall. The realtor had left 2 messages on Curtis's phone. Inside, Denise went straight to the kitchen table and began clearing a space with sharp movements. We need to put these papers somewhere safe, she said. No, Mabel said. Denise turned. Excuse me, they are safe with me. Mabel. Be reasonable. Boone moved before Mabel did. He walked to the chair where she had placed the brown envelope and sat in front of it, his body blocking the reach from the table's edge. He did not growl. He did not need to. The old dog understood what some people did with papers when they were allowed to call it organizing. Curtis looked from Boone to Denise's phone. Who were you texting? Denise froze. Mabel sat down slowly, the quilt across her lap. Let her answer. Denise's mouth tightened. The realtor. I told him we might be delayed. Curtis held out his hand. Show me. That is not fair. No, Mabel said quietly. It was not fair when you called my work trash before you knew what it had kept. Denise did not hand over the phone. She placed it face down on the counter. But in that small refusal, everyone in the kitchen saw enough. The sale had not only been urgent because the house was old. Someone had been waiting for Mabel to be too tired, too ashamed, or too outnumbered to ask why. Boone stayed in front of the envelope until Mabel rested her hand on his back. The papers had survived the quilt, the barn, and the feed store. Now they had to survive the room where the wrong name had first been put on her. The blue tin sat in the middle of the kitchen table. And for the first time, Curtis looked at it as if it might contain not money, but the cost of every year he had failed to notice. Who had the most to lose if the blue tin proved that Mabel's so-called clutter was actually a record of sacrifice? The kitchen table held the answer in pieces, and none of them looked powerful alone. A folded quilt, a tobacco tin, a receipt, a key, a feed store folder, a square of blue fabric with a date stitched so small a stranger might have missed it. Together, they changed the shape of the room. Curtis no longer stood between Mabel and the evidence. Denise no longer moved with the certainty of someone cleaning up after a confused old woman. Mabel sat with the quilt across her knees. Boone stayed beside the envelope until she told him, Easy, boy. Only then did he lower himself to the floor, his head still facing the papers. The day had drained her more than she wanted to admit. Her wrists ached. Her back throbbed. She needed water, her afternoon pill, and 10 quiet minutes with no one explaining her own life to her. Instead, she looked at her son and said, Call Mr. Voss. Curtis frowned. The old surveyor, he is not dead. I didn't say he was. You thought it like you thought I was confused, she said. Curtis looked down. I can call him. Denise pushed away from the counter. This is absurd. A retired surveyor. A feed store drawer. A dog guarding paper. We are not rebuilding an entire sale around folk memories. Mabel opened Ruth's folder. Then it should not frighten you to verify them. Mr. Edwin Voss had surveyed farms and fence lines for so long that half the county believed he had been born carrying a measuring wheel. He was 91 now and lived behind the post office. Curtis put him on speaker. Edwin, Mabel said. This is Mabel Rowe. The old man's voice crackled through. Walter's Mabel. Denise shut her eyes as if the phrase were another inconvenience. Yes, Mabel said. I found a sketch Walter made of the back spring parcel. It has a bend near the spring that is not on the county map. Edwin was silent for a moment. Did he mark the sycamore stump? No. He marked the spring. Then he was pointing you to the old witness line, not the recorded fence. Curtis leaned closer. What does that mean? It means your father knew there had been a private understanding before the formal line was cleaned up. I walked that land with him. Mabel. And with Earl. Harlan Pike was there too. I told Walter to have the papers reviewed back then. He said the family needed peace first. Mabel closed her eyes. Family peace. She had paid for it with quilt orders, then been called a hoarder for keeping the cloth that remembered. Edwin coughed. I kept a field notebook. I don't know whether it proves anything official. I am not a lawyer. But if you need the date, I have it. Curtis looked at his mother. Can we come by? Bring the old sketch? Edwin said. And bring Mabel. I won't discuss her land over her head. Mabel's hand went still on the quilt. It was the first time all day someone had named the land in a way that included her before it included a buyer. They did not go immediately. Mabel insisted on eating first. She made half a cheese sandwich because truth did not excuse an old body from needing food. Curtis filled Boone's water bowl without being asked. Denise watched from the far side of the kitchen. Phone silent now. The realtor called again. Curtis ignored it. After she ate and took her pill, they drove to Edwin Voss's house. Boone climbed into the back seat, then settled with his chin over the quilt. The old surveyor met them at the door with a cane in one hand and a cardboard tube in the other. His living room smelled of lemon oil, paper, and dust kept by people who never throw away useful things. Edwin spread Walter's sketch, Harlan's copies, and his own field notebook across a card table. His fingers were spotted and bent, but when he pointed to the lines, they did not hesitate. Here, he said. The spring was always the key. Earl wanted the backstrip included in a debt settlement. Walter objected. Mabel raised the money that made it unnecessary. Harlan noted the payments. I noted the line. The later county copy simplified the shape. But the witness notes tell the story. Denise seized on the word simplified. So the official copy is what matters. Edwin looked at her with tired patience. Ma'am, official copies matter. So do the records that explain why a family should not pretend an old woman imagined her part in them. Curtis took the blow without defending himself. Mabel watched him read the notebook. There, in Pengel, was the date embroidered on the blue fabric. There was Harlan's name. There was Walter's. And in the margin, written by Edwin Voss in a younger hand, were the words M. Rowe payment preserved spring parcel from debt sale. Curtis whispered. It says your name. No, Mabel said. It says what I did. That was the difference she needed him to understand. What she had done had been living under their meals. Beds, school shoes, Christmas mornings, and right to call the farmhouse home. Boone nudged the edge of the card table and sniffed the cardboard tube. Inside was an old copy of a field drawing with a red pencil circle around the spring. Edwin had written a note that Walter asked him to hold it in case the question returned after his death. Mabel read that line twice. Walter had known that a truth hidden for peace might one day have to come back for justice. Curtis asked Edwin for copies. Edwin agreed to write a short statement that his notebook was his own record and that Mabel had been present in the old discussions. Again, not legal advice, not a verdict, but another witness outside the family. Another layer. No one could call clutter. As they prepared to leave, Edwin touched the quilt lightly. Your work kept a farm out of shame once, he said. Funny how cloth remembers better than sons. Curtis flinched. Mabel did not protect him from the sentence. Back at the farmhouse, the light had gone amber across the yard. Denise stopped at the porch instead of going in. So what now? She asked. Mabel looked past her to the barn, the Springfield, the mailbox, the upstairs sewing room with its half-empty shelves. Now, she said, we put everything on the table. And this time, nobody answers for me. Boone went in first, crossed the kitchen, and lay down beneath the chair Walter used to sit in, facing the hallway where the realtor's papers had been left unopened. The truth was no longer hidden in the quilt. It had moved into the open, where every person in the family would have to decide whether to keep calling Mabel a hoarder, or admit the old fabric had been guarding a debt they all owed her. What does a family do when the word hoarder no longer fits the woman they used it to control? They sat around Mabel's kitchen table as evening filled the windows. Curtis placed Edwin Voss's statement beside Ruth Pike Mercer's folder. Mabel placed Walter's letter beside the blue tin. Denise stood near the counter, staring at the realtor's packet as if it could rescue a story falling apart on the porch. Boone lay beneath Walter's old chair, but his eyes stayed open. Every time Denise shifted toward the counter, his ears moved. He did not block her now. He only remembered. Curtis opened the realtor's packet. The pages described acreage, access, future potential, and a closing date that had always felt too soon to Mabel. Her name appeared only where her signature was needed. Not her work, not her history, not the spring, not the promise. Just a line where an old woman was expected to make things easy. Mabel looked at that line for a long time. "You brought me papers before you brought me questions," she said. Curtis did not defend himself. "I did." Denise looked at him sharply. "We were trying to protect you from stress." Mabel. Mabel turned the blue fabric square over in her fingers. "You protected me from information." The sentence settled on the table among the records. The room had heard loud all morning. Now it heard something harder to escape. Curtis touched the edge of Walter's letter. "Dad knew this could happen." "No," Mabel said. "Your father knew people forget what women do when the work is quiet." Denise pulled out a chair and sat at last. "I should not have called you a hoarder." Mabel did not answer quickly. An apology offered because evidence has cornered someone is not the same as understanding. "You called my work trash," Mabel said. "Before that, you called my room unhealthy. Before that, you said buyers would be nervous. Before that, you told Curtis I was too attached to things." The word was only the last stitch. Denise's face flushed. "I was worried." "About me," Denise's mouth opened, then closed. Curtis looked at her. "About what problems would the sale solve?" For several seconds, only the refrigerator hummed. Boone lifted his head. Denise pressed her fingers together. "My brother's business failed. We loaned money. More than we should have. I thought if the sale went through quickly, we could replace what we took from our savings before it damaged us." Curtis stared at her. "You told me we were fine. I thought we would be if the house sold." Mabel felt something inside her go quiet. Money trouble often wore the mask of concern. They had not wanted only to tidy her room. They had wanted her history to move aside so their urgency could pass. Mabel rested her hand on Boone's back. "This is why the papers stay here tonight," she said. "Tomorrow, Curtis, you may make copies with me present. Then we will ask someone qualified to review them." Ruth said what she could. Edwin said what he could. No one will pretend those papers are a verdict. But no one will ask me to sign while calling my proof clutter. Curtis nodded. "No one will." Denise wiped beneath one eye. "I don't know what to say." Mabel folded Walter's letter along its old crease. "Say less for a while." Curtis gathered the realtor's pages and slid them back into the packet. "I'll call him tonight. I'll tell him everything is paused." "Not everything," Mabel said. He looked up. "The cleaning is paused. The sale is paused. But the truth is not paused." He nodded slowly. "What do you want done?" Mabel looked toward the hall, where the staircase led to the sewing room. "First, the quilts come out of the trash bags. Every one. The ones worth using will be washed. The ones too damaged will be cut properly and saved if they hold names. The ones that are only cloth may still be cloth. But I will decide that, not a label." Curtis stood. "I'll bring them down." "No," Mabel said. "You will bring the bags to me. I will open them." Denise rose too. "May I help?" Mabel studied her. Help had been a dangerous word all day. Boone watched them both. Finally, Mabel said, "You may carry what I hand you. You may not sort without asking." Denise nodded. It was a small lowering. Not humiliation, but placement. For the first time, she stood where she should have stood that morning beside Mabel. Not over her. They worked slowly. Curtis brought the bags from the hall. Mabel sat at the table and opened each one. Boone sniffed every quilt as if checking it for injury. Some were ordinary scraps. Some were unfinished church pieces. One held the corner of a baby blanket Mabel had made for Curtis before he was born. He touched it and looked away. Another held a patch from Walter's red flannel shirt, and Mabel set it aside. The blue quilt stayed on the chair beside her. The tin stayed in the center of the table. The records stayed beneath Boone's watch. Near the bottom of the last bag, Denise pulled out a small paper tag that must have torn loose from the cedar chest. She read it, frowned, then handed it to Mabel without comment. On the tag, in Walter's handwriting, was one more note. Blue quilt first. Ask Mabel about the spring. Curtis saw it from across the table. His shoulders dropped, as if the final excuse had left him. Walter had not written, ask Curtis. He had not written, ask the buyer. He had written, ask Mabel. Mabel placed the tag beside the letter. Her hands were tired now, but steady. Tomorrow, she said, we will call Ruth again. We will ask Mr. Voss for copies. And you will both listen while I tell the part no paper knows. Curtis pulled out the chair across from her. Can you tell me some of it now? Mabel looked at his face. Regret made him look young in a way age never could. She could punish him with silence. She had earned that right. Instead, she chose something harder. When your Uncle Earl came to the porch, she said, he could not look at me. Walter wanted to shout. I told him shame would only make Earl sell faster. So I sewed. Your father worked. Harlan kept track. Edwin marked the line. And you went to college without knowing the spring behind the barn almost paid for another man's mistake. Curtis covered his eyes. Mabel did not comfort him. Boone rose, crossed the room, and placed his head briefly against Curtis's knee. The dog offered what Mabel did not have to. Outside, the dark gathered around the farmhouse. But the kitchen light held. On the table, the quilt, the tin, the key, the records, and Walter's note formed a line no one could sweep away. The family could still argue about repairs, money, and what came next. But the name Hoarder had lost its last hiding place. What can justice look like when no one claps? No one is ruined. And the old woman does not win by becoming cruel the next morning. Mabel woke before the sun as she always did. Her body did not know that truth had come to the kitchen table. Her knees still hurt. Her fingers still resisted the buttons on her cardigan. The house still creaked when the wind moved across the porch. Boone still needed breakfast before anyone discussed land, records, or apologies, so Mabel fed him first. She measured his food into the metal bowl, added a little warm water the way he liked it, and waited while he ate. Then she made toast, took her pill, and wrote 3 names on a yellow notepad in her careful hand: Ruth Pike Mercer, Edwin Foss, and an office in town that could review property papers without turning a family argument into a performance. She did not write sell. She did not write stay. She wrote review. That was the difference between pressure and choice. Curtis arrived at 8 with copies of Edwin's statement and a face that looked as if he had not slept. Denise came behind him carrying the cleaned cedar chest tag in a small envelope. She did not enter the sewing room. She waited in the hall and asked, "May I come in?" Mabel looked at Boone. He stood beside the rocker. Calm now. Watching but no longer guarding. "You may," Mabel said. The sewing room had changed since the day before. Not because it was empty, but because it had been seen. Quilts lay in neat stacks on the table. The blue quilt rested over the back of the wooden rocker, mended only enough to protect the hidden seam, not enough to erase it. The black trash bags were gone from the house. Curtis had taken them out before breakfast. Not to fill them again, but to fold them and put them away. Denise held out the envelope. "I found this in my purse. It must have stuck to my phone case when we were sorting." Mabel took the tag. She could have accused her. She could have asked why it had not appeared sooner. Instead, she looked at the woman's hands. They were shaking. Not enough for drama. Enough for truth. "Thank you for returning it," Mabel said. Denise swallowed. "I should have handed it to you the moment I saw it." "Yes," Mabel said. That was all. Forgiveness was not a curtain dropped over harm. It was a door Mabel would decide whether to open. And how far. They spent the morning making copies. Mabel sat beside Curtis at the town office while a clerk scanned Ruth's statement. Edwin's notebook pages. Harlan's receipt copies. Walter's letter. The map. The blue fabric date. And the cedar chest tag. The clerk did not offer legal advice. She only confirmed that the names and dates on the copies matched what had been brought in. She wrote a simple receipt for the copies and slid it across the counter to Mabel. Not Curtis. For your records. Mrs. Rowe, she said. Mabel placed it in her folder herself. Boone waited outside with Denise beneath the shade of a maple tree. When Mabel came out, Boone rose and pressed his shoulder against her leg. Denise held the leash loosely, not pulling him, not commanding him, simply keeping him safe until his person returned. It was the first useful thing she had done without making it about control. The review would take time. The papers did not magically settle the future. The farmhouse still needed repairs. The back acres still held value. Curtis still had to face the money pressure Denise had hidden from him. Mabel still had to decide what kind of help she could accept without surrendering her voice. But something important had already been settled in a place no office could stamp. No one could honestly call her a hoarder again. That afternoon, Curtis called the realtor on speaker with Mabel at the kitchen table. The sale is paused, he said. No showings. No cleaning. No signature requests. My mother has records that need review, and the family will not move forward without her direction. The realtor said something polite. Curtis listened, then repeated. Without her direction. Mabel looked down at Boone. The dog rested his chin on her shoe as if that sentence had given him permission to stop holding the house together by force of will. Denise made a second call. It was harder for her. She told her brother no money was coming from the farmhouse sale. She told him she and Curtis would handle their own mistake. Her voice cracked once. But she did not look at Mabel as if Mabel owed her rescue. That mattered. Near evening, Curtis carried Walter's chair back into the sewing room. It had been in the downstairs corner for years, half used as a place for mail. Mabel asked him to place it beside the rocker. Then she took the blue quilt and laid it across both chairs. One half over Walter's, one half over hers. The hidden seam faced outward now, not gaping open, not concealed. Witnessed. Curtis stood behind her for a while. I am sorry I called it clutter. You called it clutter because calling it work would have made you ask what it cost. Mabel said. He nodded. What can I do? Mabel looked around the room. Start by learning the names of the quilts before you decide which ones matter. So he did. She showed him the church raffle quilt, the baby blanket corner, the red flannel patch, the blue dress square, the strip from Walter's work shirt, and the scrap with the date. She did not tell the stories quickly. Age had slowed her. But it had also taught her that people who are truly listening do not need a story rushed to fit their comfort. Boone moved from quilt to quilt, sniffing each one, then settled beneath the blue quilt. His torn ear rested against the floor. For the first time since the black trash bag opened, he slept deeply. A week later, Ruth's written statement, Edwin's field note, and the copy receipt were added to Mabel's household folder. The review did not give her a dramatic victory. It gave her something quieter and more useful. The family could not complete any sale involving the disputed back acres without addressing the old spring parcel records. And Mabel's role in preserving it had to be part of the discussion. More importantly, Curtis no longer treated her signature like a formality. The cedar chest returned to the sewing room, not as a pile of things to be cleared, but as an archive of a life. Curtis repaired the loose brass latch. Denise washed the ordinary quilts only after Mabel sorted them. The damaged blue quilt was not washed. It was aired in shade, wrapped in clean cotton, and placed on the rocker where Boone could still find it. On Sunday, Curtis drove Mabel to the small community hall where a board displayed old photographs from farm auctions, church suppers, and county fairs. Ruth had found one more copy of the day Mabel won the ribbon. In the picture, Mabel stood younger and straight-backed beside a quilt frame, holding no trophy, only a folded envelope of prize money. Curtis asked the hall committee to add a label beneath the photograph. The label did not say heroine. It did not say victim. It said Mabel Rowe, whose quilt work helped preserve the Rowe spring parcel during the dead winter. Mabel read it twice. Then she reached down and touched Boone's head. "That will do," she said. Denise stood a few feet away. Quiet. Curtis wiped his eyes when he thought no one was looking. No one in the room applauded. People passed by. Read the label. And nodded the way people do when a fact has been missing too long and finally returns to its place. Mabel did not get younger. The farmhouse did not become easy. The family did not heal in one afternoon. But her name had been set back where it belonged. Beside work, promise, land, and memory. That night, the blue quilt rested over the rocker in the sewing room. Boone slept beneath it. No longer guarding, only keeping company. And when the house settled into darkness, the old fabric did what it had always done best. It held warmth. It held proof. It held the quiet truth that Mabel Rowe had never been keeping trash. She had been keeping the part of the family that remembered her correctly.